Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got up out on the bench over here is one of my African nightcrawler containers. It's the younger of the two. One of them is 116 days of age, and that's the older one. That's the one that's over there up in the middle on the top shelf in the VERMIBAG tote, which is enclosed within the plastic tub. And the one down here on the bench is a little bit younger, but not by much. It's 91 days of age. And the materials that I've got here set aside to feed them with is stuff that's been sitting in the freezer for a while. And usually when I open up my little storage bag of materials to be fed to the worms that's sitting in the freezer, I don't smell anything, but there's something in here that seems to be, I don't know, it seems to be just continuing to decompose regardless of the fact that it's being frozen. So I think it's time to just get rid of this stuff and be done with the stinkiness in my freezer. So it's getting fed to the worms today in its entirety, which means it might be a pretty generous feeding today, but that's fine. I just want to be done with this stuff. I don't know what's causing the smell, so I'm just feeding it all to them today. Well, besides applying food, I'm also going to add a little bit of grit to go along with that food. My grit is crushed eggshell, and it's pulverized to a really fine consistency, almost a powder. Some kind of weird looking stuff going on here. This worm here just did not budge, and like part of it almost looks like it's just rotting away. I wonder if this guy's even alive. Oh, look at that. There's just something very unusual about the more pale end of the worms. Maybe I'm just becoming paranoid. I thought I had observed some strange stuff in a couple of my other containers, or at least I guess one of my containers, one of my other newer containers, where I was noticing something that people have been identifying as possibly protein poisoning. This looks like a fairly recently deposited cocoon, just based on its really light coloring. And I don't know. It almost looks like something's sticking out of it, but I don't think it's hatching. Usually they have to reach a somewhat darker color before they begin to hatch. So just back to the observations I've been making in some of my other containers, or well, one other container where I've been noticing little chunks of worms, you know, like half of a worm, a piece of a worm. And people have been talking about how it might be I'm trying to remember, protein poisoning, I think is what it was referred to as. It might be the case, but now I might just be kind of seeing that everywhere I look. Maybe I'm just going to be kind of paranoid and thinking that I'm going to see issues. Alright, so now the material in this bin is pretty damp. For a while these bins were, I think they were all being left to try to air out a little bit. To try to help things dry in each case. And I kind of came to the determination not too long ago that the time for that had ended, and I think everything was kind of still damp, but perhaps not so damp and muddy that it needed to dry any further. So I went back to covering things with plastic bags here and keeping the moisture locked in to the best of my ability. And I'm still not seeing anything that's really over the top in terms of moisture. Things out here you could see crumble quite nicely. There's a good number of leftovers in here, but if you have something like this right here, which is the seed out of an avocado, and here's that avocado that the seed came out of, you wouldn't really expect that to be gone very quickly. It's a really tough item, as is this shell of a mango seed, or the husk or whatever of a mango seed. Here I've got a banana peel, some other leftovers from previous feedings. So I think just from an initial glance, you know, you would look in here and you would say, hey, there's still leftovers, why feed? I don't know. It's just what I do, because every time I start running out of space in the freezer, I feel like it's you know, time to feed the worms. And these guys were up on the list as far as the next ones to be fed. I mean, after a week's time, anything that they received a week ago probably has made some good progress breaking down. Anything that's still in here from weeks and weeks and weeks ago, you know, stuff like a mango seed or an avocado pit, those things are going to take forever anyway, so I, you know, wouldn't want to hold back on giving them anything just because I see stuff in here. Some of those items could be objects that are going to take quite some time before the worms can actually make use of them as food. So I just sort of like to backfill and sustain the food supply and keep it at a pretty high level for the most part, in most cases, in most of my bins. But there's also a little bit of a mite situation going on in my African nightcrawler bins, from what I remember. All these little tiny white dots that are scattered all over everything, they don't really move fast enough when you just look at it for an instant. You really have to kind of allow a little bit of time, and then you start to see all of those little white dots, all those little white dots of stuff, whatever it might be, that's kind of enveloping the different bits of food. It's all on the move. They do seem to congregate most heavily on the little bits of fruits. So like the pieces that we're seeing here are, I think they're plantain, apple, and avocado. I think they're all fruits. And that's where they all really seem to hone in on. And I was kind of treating this as sort of my limit, you know. If things got out of control again, you know, like if their numbers were to explode beyond this one more time, then I would certainly maybe try to take measures to reduce their numbers again. And typically what I would normally do is I just try to dry things out in the bin a little bit, which usually results in their numbers dropping. But for now, I'm leaving things be because I think that the worms do seem to favor a slightly more damp environment to be in. And it just creates a more favorable composting environment where more sections of the bin can be approached by more worms, resulting in, you know, more stuff being broken down pretty thoroughly. For today's feeding, I've got some little carbon boosts that I want to include with the food. These are just old coffee filters, of which I have quite a number. So I was just going to create little food bundles, something I used to do and sort of stepped away from doing, and I figured I would just reinstitute it here a little bit by, you know, not just dropping the food in, but dropping the food in with a little bit of a carbon boost to go hand in hand with the food. So I'm just gonna take each handful of food and include it in today's feeding along with a coffee filter. And I think I've got room here to drop in 3 such little bundles. And I'm just kind of judging it based on the amount of stuff I see remaining in my plastic bag here after I've scooped out these few. It does seem like I've got enough remaining in the plastic bag to do 3 more like this in the other system that we're going to be feeding. And you got to admit, that's a pretty generous portion of food that we just gave them. Because then, you know, it goes hand in hand with the leftovers that are still here from previous feedings. So even though maybe the last feeding that this bin received was maybe not quite as generous, I would definitely have to say that today's feeding is very generous. So to try to help all of this food get broken down, I'm going to go ahead and give it a nice portion of grit, a little bit of eggshell to go hand in hand with that food. And then I guess after we get things covered up here, we'll see what we could do as far as taking any other scraps of food we encounter and make sure that they're down in there with the rest of the food. We'll get a little look at how things are progressing out here on these edges. The material in this bin looks really nice. A lot of nice castings, but you know, the material is riddled with all kinds of other stuff that's not yet broken down. But it's nice and dark and rich in color. It's got a nice kind of moisture content to it. Here and there I find, you know, something like a banana peel. I always sort of feel like it should be in the center area where we're fed. Keep all the food sorted together if possible. In some of my other bins I had switched over to feeding in the corners, so sort of instituting a little bit of a pocket feeding idea. I don't know. I thought about doing that here too, but then I figured, let's just stick with what we've been doing in here for consistency's sake. Okay, not bad. Not bad for a 91-day-old container. You know, 91 days puts you right shy of 3 months. Just shy of 3 months by a couple days, I would say. So, so this seems like it could be a potential candidate for starting to wind things down, you know. Maybe stop feeding, give the worms a chance to really work out whatever little bit of residual food that remains scattered throughout the bin. And as you can see here, I'm trying to get rid of my coffee filters. So we're going to use one of them as an indicator to show us where we just fed to, which was something that was absent in this container. And I'm pretty sure from what I remember, it was absent from the next container that we're going to feed as well. So I'll do the same there, as I'll use the coffee filters as a sort of a carbon bedding type wrapping for the food, but then we'll also use one to indicate where we just fed. All right, let's get the other container out here too and get that one fed as well. Okay, so now this is the older of the two systems, and it's a little different. It's inside of a plastic tote like the other system was, but this is a slightly deeper tote, and lining the tote is a bag system. It's the VERMIBAG tote. So I don't know, it's probably not even correct to call this plastic tub a tote, because totes are, I think, a little bit bigger. I think it's more accurate to consider this plastic container as a bus box or a bus bin. That's really what it is. It's one of those containers that you see the bus boy coming around with to collect all the soiled silverware and plates and dishes and cups from your table at the restaurant. So we'll see what we could do in terms of getting some of these worms to skedaddle off this paper before we set it aside. Yeah, we did a pretty good job evicting those little guys. See if there's any remaining on here. Okay. I usually try to get rid of any hitchhikers from the paper coverings. Now here too, I'm fairly sure that all these little white specks that we're seeing everywhere, and we'll see more when we get down to some of the food leftovers that are still in here. These are all mites too. I'm sure I've got them in all of my containers, but it just seems like in these two containers they were sort of running a little bit rampant. So maybe we'll... Ooh, it's a little bit dry. Much drier out here than I'm used to seeing. It's kind of something to almost be expected, you know. The air comes in pretty easily along the sides of the container, possibly allowing for some of the moisture in the bin to wick through the material and evaporate away. So things in here seem to be a little bit more dry than we saw in the last container, but not too dry. Not dry enough that it would make me, you know, react or worry at this point. Out here on this edge, maybe not so much. Maybe because there's fewer gaps, fewer openings, allowing for airflow. I'm not quite sure what the real difference here would be. Well, out on the edges I found a few scraps. This is like the stem of something. I believe this was like the banana peel stem. A couple little scraps of leftover food we encountered already. But since we've been feeding down the middle, I think that's where we would expect to find the greatest numbers of leftovers. So let's see what else we find in here as we make a little bit of space to add today's feeding. Maybe it would be nice to see if we can get a sense of how many mites are hanging out in this container. Maybe not quite as many as what we saw in the last one. Good number of worms. Possibly a larger number of worms in here than in the other one that we just fed. This is just like the stem of a bunch of tomatoes. A lot of what I'm picking out of here looks like it's just bedding, some of the paper that we had placed down into the feeding area. But like, here's a chunk of food. Not sure exactly what it is, but it seems to be riddled with little white specks. Same thing here, maybe a piece of apple or something. So I think we are starting to encounter a couple of the leftovers that might be more prone to mite activity. But certainly not like we saw in the other bin. I mean, I know there's mites everywhere. I could see the little white specks almost everywhere, zipping around. But somehow it just doesn't seem quite as intense as we saw in the other container. So with this bin being 116 days of age, I would typically be looking to maybe start winding things down and start preparing the bin for harvest. But it seems like maybe I've just been giving this bin small feedings or something, because I believe that the previous feedings amounted to 15 in quantity in the number of feedings that this bin has received over time, with today's feeding registering as feeding number 16 in my tracking system. So I would typically be looking to take a bin that has now exceeded 100 days of age and start trying to wind it down and get it ready for harvest. But in this case, it just seems like we've hardly accumulated any material in here. It just doesn't seem like it's really approaching capacity quite yet. So I'm not really that anxious to get to that stage yet in this bin. I might start soon, especially if we add a couple more large feedings like this one right here. Because then we'll start, approaching the fill line. Not that there's a line anywhere, but I guess there's this sort of sense where you start feeling like you're filling up the container beyond the point where you would want it to be. Maybe it's just becoming difficult to work in there because of the limited amount of space that remains. Here's a little plum pit, something that I doubt is going to get completed prior to this bin being ready for harvest and worm migration. So that's probably just a little food bit that's going to travel with the worms to their new home, wherever that may be someday. So, yeah, look at this material, though. The material looks really nice. Very similar to the material we saw in the other bin, perhaps not as littered with little bits of stuff that's not yet composted down. But really nice material in here. All right. I guess we're going to have to keep an eye on the moisture levels in here with, these outer edges starting to appear as if they're getting a little bit extra ventilation. Maybe I just didn't have the covers on quite as thoroughly as I could have. Maybe I just need to take a little bit more care in making sure that the plastic covers are thoroughly covering the top to not allow for too much airflow off the top surface and too much evaporation. So we'll be careful to make sure we put back the plastic coverings thoroughly when we finish here. And I think we are finished here. I mean, I've got a couple little tiny scraps of stuff remaining in the food container that I bought down here. It's not much, but there's a little bit of blueberry, a little bit of this and that left in here that I'm just going to throw back into one of my other freezer bags. I didn't want to force all of it into here. We just, you know, gave it a best effort, and we came close to using it all up, which was kind of nice. I've still got plenty in my freezer, that's for sure. So yeah, I gotta figure out a way of doing away with all of these kitchen scraps that keep piling up. I have to start setting up some new worm bins, expanding my population a little bit. All right, so we added food, we added grit, we even added a little bit of extra bedding to go along with the food, which is always a good thing. And here, I think we're going to just try to take care to see if we can make sure our plastic covering goes edge to edge all the way around to the best of our ability. Try to lock in all that moisture so none of it escapes. Alright, so I think that's all I've got for you today. We've got our African night crawlers all fed. And yeah, a lot of people have commented on the appearance of these worms. A lot of people say that they're not even African night crawlers, but it's what I was told that they were when I received the cocoons that they all hatched out of. So until I know better, I'm just continuing to refer to them as my African night crawlers. All right, I'm gonna get things put away and cleaned up around here, but I'm not gonna take your time with that. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.